I never believed in the stories my grandfather told around the fire until I stood alone in his cabin, 3 days after we buried him, holding a brass urn that felt too light to contain a man who had lived so large in my memory. The cabin sat exactly where he'd left it, perched on the edge of 40 acres of northern Michigan wilderness, surrounded by white pines that seemed to lean in closer than I remembered, their branches scraping the roof like fingernails on wood. My mother had insisted I be the one to scatter his ashes, said he'd wanted it that way, but she'd refused to come with me, and I'd seen something flicker across her face when I agreed, something that looked uncomfortably like relief. The drive up had been 7 hours of silence and secondhand guilt, replaying his final words to me in the hospital, his papery hand gripping mine with surprising strength. As his eyes went distant and afraid, he'd pulled me close enough that I could smell the medicine and the decay, and whispered with a clarity that cut through the morphine haze, his voice urgent and raw. When you go back to scatter me, stay on the trails, stay in the light, and if you hear me calling you, if you hear me say your name the way I used to, don't answer. I'd thought it was the drugs talking, the mind unraveling in those final hours, but standing in that cabin with darkness pressing against the windows, I felt the weight of those words settle into my bones like winter cold. The cabin still smelled like him, like tobacco and pine sap and old leather, and everywhere I looked, I saw the evidence of a life lived in careful solitude, in watchful waiting. On the mantel sat photographs spanning decades, but I noticed for the first time how few showed him smiling, how often his gaze seemed fixed on something just beyond the camera's frame. The fire in the hearth had long gone cold, but I could almost hear his voice in the settling of the floorboards, almost feel his presence in the way shadows gathered in the corners. I told myself I was here to say goodbye, to honor his final wish, but the truth was darker and more desperate than that. I was here because I needed to understand what had haunted him, what fear had lived behind his eyes in those last moments, what he'd been trying to warn me about when he spoke of the one who walks and talks like us but isn't. The first night I didn't sleep, just sat in his old chair by the window, watching the tree line, remembering childhood summers when he'd taught me to track deer and read the forest's moods. He'd been patient then, careful, but always there'd been rules, boundaries he'd insisted I never cross, warnings wrapped in the language of common sense and wildlife safety. Don't wander after dark, don't follow animal calls that sound too clever, don't trust your ears when the fog rolls in thick from the lake. I'd thought he was just being overprotective, the way adults are with children they love and fear losing. But now those warnings echoed differently, resonated with something primal and urgent. In the pre-dawn darkness, I watched as fog began to creep between the trees, thick and luminous like something alive, swallowing the familiar landmarks until the world beyond the window became a gray and shifting mystery. I'd planned to hike out at sunrise to the place he'd loved most, a ridge overlooking a beaver pond, where he'd said he wanted his ashes scattered to the wind. The urn sat on the table beside me, catching the first pale light of morning, and I realized my hands were shaking as I reached for it, though I couldn't say if it was from exhaustion or something deeper, some instinct that whispered I was about to cross a threshold I could never uncross. When I finally opened the cabin door, the fog rushed in like it had been waiting, cold and damp, against my face, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves and something else, something animal and old. The forest felt wrong the moment I stepped onto the trail, though I couldn't immediately name what had changed or why every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back. The fog hung in layers between the pines, creating corridors and false clearings that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the usual morning chorus of birds was utterly, completely absent. I'd hiked these woods 100 times in my youth, knew them like the rooms of my childhood home, but now they felt foreign and watchful, as if the trees themselves had rearranged in the night to form new patterns, new warnings. I clutched the urn against my chest and pushed forward, following the trail markers my grandfather had painted on stones decades ago, their faded orange a lifeline in the gray. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft crunch of last autumn's leaves beneath my boots, and that silence pressed against my eardrums until they ached with the strain of listening. I was perhaps 20 minutes from the cabin, just reaching the place where the trail splits toward the ridge, when I heard it, clear as morning bells, impossible as resurrection, my grandfather's voice, calling from somewhere deep in the fog-wrapped trees to my left, speaking the nickname he'd given me when I was 5 years old, a name no one else had ever used. A name I hadn't heard in the 3 years since I'd last visited before his illness took hold. The voice was perfect, every inflection and rough edge exactly as I remembered, and despite everything he'd warned me against, despite the ice that suddenly flooded my veins, I found myself turning toward it, found my feet leaving the marked trail, found grief and longing overriding every instinct for survival as I walked into the unmarked forest, following the voice of a dead man deeper into the waiting fog. The voice called again, closer now, and I realized with a sick certainty that it was coming from somewhere just beyond a dense thicket of young pines, their branches so tightly woven they formed a wall of green darkness. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that my grandfather's body was ash in the urn I still clutched, that sound could play tricks in fog, that grief could conjure anything, but the voice knew things only he could know, spoke with the exact cadence of his stories, carried the warmth of summer nights when I'd felt safest in all the world. I pushed through the branches, needles scraping my face and hands, leaving thin lines of blood I barely noticed, and emerged into a part of the forest I didn't recognize, where the trees grew strangely twisted and the fog seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, almost like breathing. The voice had stopped, leaving only that oppressive silence, and I stood there gasping, scanning the gray spaces between the pines, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon me. That's when I noticed the trees themselves, the way their bark had been stripped in long vertical gouges, the wood beneath, pale and exposed, marked with patterns that were too deliberate to be random, too purposeful to be natural. The claw marks stood at least 7 feet high, carved deep into the trunk of an ancient oak, and as I approached with trembling legs I saw they formed something almost like symbols, almost like a language written in violence and warning. The forest floor around the marked trees was bare of undergrowth, as if nothing dared take root in this place, and scattered among the dead leaves I found bones, small ones at first, then larger, arranged in ways that suggested intelligence, intention, ritual. The silence had become a physical presence, a pressure against my skin that made even breathing feel like an intrusion, a violation of some sacred and terrible quiet. I'd experienced silence in the wilderness before, those moments when predators pass and prey freezes, but this was different, deeper, as if every living thing for miles had fled or fallen into some collective held breath. No insects hummed, no squirrels chattered their warnings, no wind moved through the branches that hung motionless and watching overhead. I realized I'd walked much farther than I'd intended, that the fog had turned me around, that I had no idea which direction would lead me back to the marked trail or the cabin beyond. My phone showed no signal, which I'd expected, but also no GPS, the screen displaying only a spinning circle where my location should be, as if I'd stepped off the map entirely, into some pocket of wilderness that existed outside the usual coordinates. That's when I saw it through the fog, perhaps 50 yards ahead, the angular shape of my grandfather's old hunting blind, a structure I'd thought was at least 2 miles south of where I'd been hiking, now impossibly near. The blind sat in a small clearing ringed by those same marked trees, and as I approached I felt the certainty growing that I'd been led here, that the voice had drawn me to this specific place with purpose and design. The wooden ladder up to the platform looked weathered but intact, and something about the blind itself suggested recent use, a maintained quality that shouldn't exist years after my grandfather had stopped hunting. I climbed the ladder with the urn awkwardly tucked under one arm, each rung creaking under my weight, announcing my presence to whatever watched from the surrounding forest. The blind's interior smelled of mildew and old canvas, but there on the small bench sat an object that made my blood run cold, a weathered leather journal that I recognized immediately as my grandfather's, its cover marked with water stains and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. My hands shook as I opened it, the pages brittle and foxed with age, filled with his precise handwriting and sketches that grew increasingly frantic toward the end. The early entries were ordinary observations, deer movements and weather patterns, the practical notes of a hunter who respected his prey. But as I flipped forward the content shifted, became darker, more urgent, documenting something he'd seen or thought he'd seen. Moving through the trees at dawn, the sketches started appearing around the 3rd year of entries, rough at first, then increasingly detailed, showing a figure that my mind struggled to categorize. Something caught between wolf and man, something that stood upright on legs too long and bent at angles that defied mammalian anatomy. He'd written, beside one particularly detailed drawing, "It watches from the ridge, always at twilight, always just beyond clear sight, but I've seen its eyes catch the light. And they aren't animal eyes. They're aware. They're calculating. They're studying us the way we study them. The later entries spoke of the mimic, a name he'd apparently learned from somewhere or someone, describing how it would call to him in voices of the dead, testing him, measuring his reactions, learning the shapes of human grief and longing. One passage made me stop breathing entirely, made the cabin's walls seem to press inward. It called to me tonight in Sarah's voice. My Sarah who's been gone 15 years, and I almost went to it, almost walked into those trees because I've been so lonely. But then I remembered what the old ones told me, that it's been here longer than our families, that it's watched us for generations, that it collects our voices like we collect its tracks. And I understood that this is why we've always stayed, why we've never sold this land, because someone has to remember, someone has to witness, someone has to maintain the agreement our ancestors made in a language we've almost forgotten. I was still reading when the light began to change, when I realized with shock that hours had passed in what felt like minutes, that the fog-gray day had slipped toward evening without my notice. And that's when I heard it again, the voice that was no longer just my grandfather's, but shifting, morphing, cycling through sounds that squeezed my heart like a fist. It spoke in my grandfather's warm rumble, then slid into my own voice calling for help, then twisted into the high bright laugh of Emma, my best friend from childhood, drowned in the lake 20 years ago, each voice perfect and terrible and impossible. The sounds came from multiple directions now, circling the blind, and I realized the creature was moving around me, pacing out some ritual or assessment, studying me as my grandfather had described. I crawled to the edge of the platform and looked down into the clearing, and there in the gathering darkness between the marked trees I saw it for the first time, not clearly but enough, a massive silhouette that moved on four legs but seemed wrong in its proportions, its shoulders too high, its head too large and angular, its movement too fluid and purposeful to be any wolf or bear I'd ever encountered. It paused at the edge of visibility, and I felt rather than saw its attention fix upon me, felt the weight of its intelligence like a hand pressed against my chest. And in that moment I understood with absolute clarity that my grandfather had been right, that this thing was ancient and aware, that it had been watching my family not as a predator watches prey but as something else watches, with curiosity and perhaps recognition, maintaining some connection that stretched back beyond memory into the foundational stories we'd forgotten how to tell. The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned degrees and lived in cities with streetlights and explanations, screamed at me to run, to climb down from the blind and sprint back toward the cabin or the road, or anything resembling civilization, but something deeper, something that lived in the oldest corridors of my consciousness, understood that running would be the worst possible choice, that flight would trigger instincts I didn't want to trigger, would transform me from witness into prey. I remained absolutely still, pressed against the rough wooden planks of the blind's floor, watching that massive silhouette as it paced the perimeter of the clearing, with movements that were simultaneously animal and not, each step deliberate and measured, as if it were performing some ceremony that predated human language. The voice that emerged from its form now carried no human words, just a sound that seemed to ripple through multiple registers at once, a low resonant tone that I felt in my bones before I heard it with my ears, and beneath that, almost hidden, something that sounded heartbreakingly like singing, like the wordless melody my grandfather would hum while cooking breakfast on cold mornings when the lake was still frozen and the world felt small and safe. I found myself crying without having decided to cry, tears streaming down my face as I watched this impossible thing circle and call. And I realized the tears weren't from fear alone, but from something more complex, a grief that had found its shape, a longing that finally had an object, as if everything I'd been unable to articulate about loss and inheritance and the weight of being the last one left had manifested in flesh and shadow before me. My grandfather's journal still lay open beside me, and my eyes fell on a passage I'd skipped in my earlier frantic reading. His handwriting, especially careful here, each letter formed with the precision he used when he wanted me to remember something important. The mimic is not what the settlers thought it was, not a demon or a devil, but something older than those concepts, something that was here when the first people arrived and will be here when the last ones leave. And it doesn't hunt us so much as it studies us, collects our voices the way we might collect songs, preserving something of who we were, what we sounded like when we called to those we loved. The words rearranged my understanding, shifted the creature from monster to something else entirely, something that existed in the category I had no name for. And I thought about all the voices it must carry, centuries of names called across water, mothers singing to children, hunters signaling to each other in the pre-dawn darkness, lovers whispering in the shelter of these same trees that had witnessed every iteration of human presence on this land. The creature had stopped pacing now and stood perfectly still at the tree line, and in the deepening twilight I could make out more detail. The way its form seemed to shimmer at the edges as if it weren't entirely solid, as if it existed partially in this world and partially in some adjacent space where the rules of flesh and bone operated differently. Its head turned toward me with an articulation that was too smooth, too fluid, and I saw the gleam of eyes that reflected the last light with an amber glow, eyes that were indeed too knowing, too present, too weighted with observation and memory to belong to any ordinary animal. The impulse came, suddenly, unbidden, rising from that same deep place that had told me not to run, and I found myself reaching for my phone with shaking hands, not to call for help because there was no signal, and who would I call anyway? Who would believe this? But to document, to capture, to create evidence that would survive even if I didn't. Because suddenly it felt desperately important that this moment be recorded, that someone beyond me know that this thing existed, that my grandfather hadn't been losing his mind in his final years, but had been bearing witness to something real and profound. The phone screen was shockingly bright in the gathering darkness, and I fumbled with the camera app, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline, finally managing to start a video recording that captured the clearing below in grainy, unstable footage. Through the phone screen I watched the creature more closely than I'd dared with naked eyes, saw the way its massive form seemed to absorb light, rather than reflect it, how it moved with a grace that suggested perfect awareness of every muscle and joint despite its size, and I zoomed in as much as the camera allowed, trying to capture detail, trying to document the impossible architecture of its shape. The voice came again, but now it was my own voice I heard, my own words calling my own name in tones of distress and confusion. Help me, please, I'm lost. I can't find the way back. And the dissonation of hearing myself from outside myself, while remaining silent, was so profound that I nearly dropped the phone, nearly lost the footage to the forest floor 15 feet below. The creature's behavior changed the instant. It noticed the recording light, that small red dot glowing on my phone's surface like an eye, reflecting back at it, and the transformation was immediate and terrible. All pretense of human voice vanishing as a sound erupted from its form, that seemed to come from the earth itself, a guttural resonance that was part growl, part thunder, part the groan of ice breaking on a frozen lake, a sound that carried rage and warning and something else I couldn't name, perhaps offense, perhaps recognition that the terms of our encounter had shifted into territory neither of us had intended. The thing that had been pacing the perimeter suddenly moved with horrifying speed, closing the distance to the blind, in 3 massive bounds that shook the ground, and I could see it clearly now in the phone's dim light, see the way its body was covered in fur that seemed to move independently of wind or motion, see the elongation of its muzzle that was wolf-like, but wrong in its proportions, see the hands, God help me they were hands not paws, that gripped the earth as it moved, fingers too long and tipped with claws that left furrows in the soil. It began to circle the blind's base with tight, deliberate movements, and I understood with crystalline certainty that it was intelligent enough to be angry, aware enough to feel violated by my documentation, and powerful enough to collapse this entire structure if it chose, to end this encounter on terms that would leave nothing but another set of bones ranged in patterns on the forest floor. Through the phone's screen, I watched those impossible hands grip the wooden posts of the blind, watched them test the structure's integrity with a methodical patience that spoke of problem-solving capability, of analytical thought, and in that moment of pure terror something in me shifted. Some understanding passed through the adrenaline and into clear water, and I remembered my grandfather's words about respect rather than fear, about how the mimic wasn't hunting but preserving, collecting, remembering. I lowered the phone slowly, deliberately, until the recording light no longer pointed at the creature but at the floor of the blind, a gesture of submission, of acknowledgement, and I spoke aloud in a voice that shook but held steady enough, using words I hadn't said since childhood, words in the language my grandfather had taught me before English consumed everything else, the old prayers his father had taught him and his father before that, words for safe passage and honorable encounter, for requesting permission to walk in places that belonged to Others first. The circling stopped immediately, and in the sudden silence I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the distant sound of the lake lapping against its shores, could hear the subtle shift of the creature's weight as it recalibrated its response to this new development. What happened next unfolded in a space beyond ordinary time, where seconds stretched into something more elastic and encompassing, and I watched as the creature moved back from the blind, not in retreat, but in reconsideration, its massive form settling into a sitting position at the clearing's edge perhaps 20 feet away, close enough that I could see the rise and fall of its breathing, could observe the way its head tilted in an attitude of listening that was so familiar. It made my chest ache with recognition because it was exactly how my grandfather would tilt his head when I spoke to him in his final days, that same quality of deep attention, of gathering every nuance and storing it somewhere safe. I continued speaking in the old language, fumbling through phrases about gratitude and lineage, about carrying forward what had been given to me, about understanding that some knowledge came not from books but from bearing witness. And as I spoke I saw the creature's form seem to soften at its edges, that shimmering quality intensifying as if my words were affecting its physical coherence, as if language itself had power in this space between worlds. The amber eyes never left me, and I found myself unable to look away, drawn into a communion that required no common tongue, that operated on frequencies older than vocabulary, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was what my grandfather had experienced, this recognition that passed between species, between ways of being, this acknowledgement that consciousness took forms we had no right to judge or quantify. The creature began to vocalize again, but the quality had transformed entirely from the threatening growl of moments before, and what emerged now was that sound I'd heard earlier, that heartbreaking approximation of singing, a melody that wove through registers no human voice could reach, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways, and threaded through it I heard fragments of my grandfather's humming, snippets of songs my mother used to sing, the laugh of my childhood friend who had drowned in the lake 20 years ago, all of it preserved and returned not as mockery but as gift, as evidence of what had been witnessed and remembered and honored. I realized I was hearing my family's sonic history, the archive of our presence on this land rendered back to me by something that had watched us across generations, that had stood in the shadows of our gatherings and absorbed our joy and grief and ordinary moments, collecting us the way we might press flowers between pages, preserving the ephemeral before it vanished into the indifferent machinery of time. Tears came again, but different now, not from fear but from a gratitude so profound it had no adequate expression, and I found myself humming along with fragments I recognized, adding my voice to this strange duet, this communion between the inheritor and the keeper, and for a moment that stretched into forever we sang together in the darkness, human and other, both mourning and celebrating everything that had been and would never be again. The creature rose, slowly, gracefully, its movements now carrying no threat but rather a ceremonial quality, and it approached the blind one final time, close enough that I could have reached down and touched the fur that seemed to absorb starlight, close enough that I could smell it, an odor of pine and earth and something wild that had no civilized equivalent, and those two human eyes met mine with an intensity that felt like recognition, like the moment when a secret passes between conspirators, when an inheritance is acknowledged and accepted. It held my gaze for a period I couldn't measure, and in that exchange something transferred, some understanding that I was now part of the chain my grandfather had been part of, that I had been chosen or tested, or simply observed and found worthy of this knowledge, this burden, this strange and terrible gift. Then the creature released a final sound, that mournful singing that seemed to contain all the goodbye songs ever sung, and it turned with fluid grace and moved toward the tree line, its form already beginning to blur at the edges, to merge with shadow and moonlight, and I watched it go until I could no longer distinguish its shape from the darkness between the pines, until the forest had reclaimed it completely, and I was alone again with my phone still recording, and my grandfather's journal pressed against my chest like a talisman against forgetting. The walk back to the cabin occurred in a state of dissociation so complete that I couldn't later account for how my feet found the path, how my body navigated the darkness that should have been impenetrable, moving through the forest as if guided by some external intelligence that had temporarily taken residence in my nervous system and was piloting me home with methodical efficiency. The phone remained clutched in my hand, its recording light finally extinguished, its battery drained by the hours of documentation that I both desperately wanted to review, and feared with a terror that made my stomach clench, because part of me understood that what the device had captured might not align with what I had witnessed. That technology and ancient encounter might speak incompatible languages, might produce evidence that either validated everything or rendered me dangerously unmoored from consensus reality. My grandfather's journal remained pressed against my ribs where I'd tucked it into my jacket, its pages carrying the warmth of my body now, as if the transfer of heat was itself a form of inheritance, a passing of responsibility from the dead to the living, from the keeper to the kept. The woods around me no longer felt threatening, but rather watchful in a way that suggested evaluation rather than predation, and I found myself wondering how many times I'd walked through forests feeling observed, dismissing it as paranoia or imagination, never considering that the sensation might be accurate testimony, that eyes without malice might track us through our lives, collecting and remembering and preserving us in ways we'd never comprehend. When the cabin finally emerged from the darkness, its familiar outline seemed alien somehow, as if I'd been gone for years rather than hours, as if crossing back into the world of electric lights and running water required a translation I no longer possessed fluently, and I stood at the edge of the clearing for long minutes just staring at it, at this structure my grandfather had built with his own hands, wondering what he'd been thinking each time he hammered a nail, whether every board placement had been informed by the knowledge of what watched from the trees, whether the cabin's positioning had been negotiation rather than choice. Inside, I couldn't bring myself to turn on the overhead lights, instead lighting the old kerosene lamp he'd always preferred, its warm glow pushing back the darkness in ways that felt more respectful somehow, less aggressive than the harsh certainty of electricity. And in that gentler illumination I finally opened his journal again, reading with new comprehension the entries I'd skimmed before, seeing how his handwriting changed over the years from confident and skeptical to uncertain to something approaching reverence, watching his sketches evolve from crude attempts to capture what he'd glimpsed into detailed studies that suggested repeated observation, sustained encounter, relationship. One entry near the end stopped my breath entirely, dated just 3 weeks before his death, and it read, "It came to the porch last night, close enough to touch the glass, and I understood it was saying goodbye, that it knew before I did that my time was finishing, and I asked it without words to watch over the one who comes after me, to test them as it tested me, to show them what I could never explain." And it touched its hand to the window where mine pressed from inside, and I felt the cold glass between us like the membrane between worlds, thin enough to see through, but never to cross. And I was grateful for both the separation and the connection, for the mercy of boundaries and the gift of witness. My hands shook so badly the lamplight danced across the page, and I realized my grandfather had orchestrated this entire encounter, had set in motion the circumstances that would lead me into those woods, that would position me to receive what he'd carried alone for so many years. The phone sat on the table before me, like a judgment waiting to be rendered, its dark screen reflecting the lamp's flame, and I knew I had to review the recording, but found myself paralyzed by competing fears, terrified both that it would show nothing but static and empty forest, proving my experience a grief-induced hallucination, and equally terrified that it would capture everything with documentary clarity, forcing me to confront the impossible made undeniable, the mythological rendered forensic. I thought about my grandfather's warning, about how some truths were meant to be carried rather than shared, about how evidence and understanding were not always compatible, about how the modern compulsion to document and distribute might violate something sacred in the contract between witness and phenomenon, might transform encounter into entertainment, mystery into content, the numinous into the viral. But I also understood that this recording was why the creature had stopped, why it had responded with aggression to the phone's light, not because it feared capture but because it was testing me, evaluating whether I would choose documentation over experience, whether I would prioritize proof over respect. I sat with my hand hovering over the phone for what felt like hours, the kerosene lamp casting shifting shadows that made the cabin's walls seem to breathe, and finally I pressed play with the sensation of opening a door that could never be closed again, of crossing a threshold that would permanently alter the geography of what I considered possible. The first minutes showed exactly what I'd filmed, the foggy forest rendered in the phone's inadequate resolution, trees emerging from mist like the bars of an enormous cage, and then my grandfather's voice, so clear and perfect that tears blurred my vision, calling the nickname he'd used when I was small, when the world was simple and death was something that happened to other people in distant futures we'd never have to inhabit. But as I watched, I noticed something my terrified attention had missed during the actual encounter. A pattern in how the voice moved through the forest, not randomly, but in a deliberate spiral, drawing me inward with mathematical precision. And I realized the creature hadn't been luring me toward danger, but rather toward the hunting blind, toward the journal, toward the inheritance my grandfather had left. That every moment of apparent threat had been guidance disguised as fear. The recording continued, through my discovery of the journal, capturing my whispered reactions and the sound of pages turning, and I heard in my own voice a quality I didn't recognize, something older and steadier than my normal speech, as if the presence of the creature had called forth an ancestral composure I didn't know I possessed, had activated some dormant genetic memory of how to exist in proximity to the sacred and terrifying. When the recording reached the clearing, the moment I'd glimpsed the silhouette moving between the pines, I leaned closer to the screen with my heart hammering against my ribs, and what I saw made me understand why my grandfather had never tried to photograph what he'd witnessed, why his journal contained only sketches made from memory rather than images captured in the moment. The creature appeared on screen not as a solid form, but as an absence, a place where the camera's sensor couldn't quite resolve reality. A shimmer like heat distortion or the blind spot at the center of vision, and yet somehow more present than anything else in the frame. More real precisely because it resisted documentation, because it existed in the gap between perception and proof. But the audio captured everything with devastating clarity. The voice that shifted between my grandfather and myself and Tommy Peterson's 8-year-old laugh. The sound of my childhood friend who'd drowned in the lake during the summer I turned 9. Whose death had carved a silence into my family that we'd never filled with adequate words. Hearing his voice again after 23 years shattered something in my chest, released a grief I'd packed away with such efficiency that I'd forgotten I was still carrying it, and I understood suddenly that the creature wasn't just mimicking sounds, but pulling them from my own memory, from the deepest archives of my experience, showing me that it knew me with an intimacy that should have felt violating, but instead felt like recognition. Like being truly seen by something whose vision penetrated all the careful constructions of self we build to navigate the social world. The moment of revelation came when the creature noticed the phone's recording light, and I watched my own footage with new comprehension, seeing how immediately the human voices stopped, how the ancient growl that replaced them wasn't anger but disappointment, how the creature's circling wasn't predatory stalking but rather the pacing of something wounded by betrayal. By my choice to prioritize evidence over communion, I could see in the shaky footage how its movement changed when I began speaking the half-remembered prayer, how the deliberate menace transformed into something approaching curiosity, and I realized the prayer wasn't protection but rather apology, wasn't a ward against evil but an acknowledgement of presence, a recognition of the creature's sovereignty in this place, and my grandfather had known this, had left me the words not as a weapon but as a gesture of diplomacy. When the creature stepped into the moonlight in the recording, I paused the video and stared at the frozen image, at the way the phone had managed to capture not its physical form but something else, entirely, a kind of radiance or density that seemed to bend the pixels around it, and in what should have been its eyes I saw points of light that looked less like biological organs, and more like stars, like windows into some vast intelligence that were the shape of a wolf, the way we might wear clothing, as convenience rather than truth. The recording's final moments showed my stumbling retreat, the phone's microphone catching the mournful singing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that the device rendered as layered frequencies that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce, and then the screen went dark as the battery died, except it didn't cut to black, but rather faded through a spectrum of colors I couldn't name, hues that seemed to exist outside the normal range of visible light. And I wondered if the creature's proximity had affected the phone's electronics in ways that revealed its true nature, had momentarily expanded the device's capacity to register wavelengths beyond its designed specifications. I let the recording play into its static conclusion, and that's when I heard it, crystal clear beneath the white noise. My grandfather's voice speaking words the microphone shouldn't have been able to capture, because the battery was dead, because the recording had officially ended. Now you understand why we never forget, why our family has always returned to this land, why we build our cabins in these particular woods and teach our children to walk softly and observe before speaking, because we are not merely residents but witnesses. chosen not for our strength, but for our capacity to remember, to carry the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more populated than the maps acknowledge, that we share this existence with intelligences that knew these forests before humans walked upright, that watched us evolve and learn language and build our civilizations, and have chosen for reasons we cannot fathom, to occasionally reveal themselves, to select certain bloodlines as keepers of their reality, as bridges between the documented and the undocumentable. His voice faded into static that slowly resolved into something almost like music, like the mournful singing layered with wind through pine branches and distant wolf howls, and the specific creaking of this cabin's floorboards under the weight of generations. And I understood I was hearing not just a recording but an inheritance, a passing of responsibility that stretched back beyond my grandfather to ancestors, whose names I'd never learned, but whose blood carried memory like rivers carry minerals, essential and invisible, and shaping everything they touched. I sat in the lamplight with the weight of my grandfather's words settling into my bones like sediment, like something that had always been there, but only now became visible. And I realized the recording hadn't truly ended, that the static contained patterns I could almost decipher if I listened with something other than my ears, with the part of me that had known to speak that prayer, that had felt the creature's presence not as invasion but as homecoming. The phone screen remained black, but the speaker continued its layered whisper, and I understood with sudden crystalline clarity that the creature was still speaking, was using the device as a medium because it had learned our technologies the way it had learned our voices, by observation spanning centuries, by patient study of the tools we mistook for power. And it was choosing this moment to reveal the true terms of the inheritance my grandfather had left me. I thought about how he'd spent his final months here alone, how he'd refused hospice care and insisted on returning to this cabin, how his last words to me weren't goodbye, but rather that cryptic warning I'd interpreted as dementia, as the cruel deterioration of a brilliant mind, when in fact he'd been trying to prepare me to compress a lifetime of accumulated wisdom into a single phrase, because he knew his time had become countable in hours rather than years, knew the creature would come for me as it had come for him, as it had apparently come for generations of our family. In moments of transition between death and inheritance, the static shifted and I heard beneath it a sound like breathing, like the massive inhalation and exhalation of something whose lungs processed air in volumes incompatible with any anatomy I'd studied. And I realized the creature was still close, still watching, had perhaps followed me back to the cabin and waited outside in the darkness that pressed against the windows, like water against a submarine's hull, patient and crushing and absolute. I thought about the journal entry I'd photographed, the one where my grandfather wrote about the night his own father died, how he'd gone into the woods and encountered the creature for the first time, how it had greeted him with his father's voice saying words of guidance his father had never spoken in life, as if the creature served as repository not just for sounds but for wisdom, for things that needed to be said but couldn't be voiced by the dying, who were too consumed with the mechanics of departure to offer proper farewell. My hands trembled as I picked up the journal itself, the physical object my grandfather had held countless times, his handwriting growing shakier in the final pages but more urgent, more insistent that I understand what he could barely articulate, that the creature wasn't predator or monster, but something closer to guardian, to witness, to the intelligence that maintains balance in places where human understanding frays into territory we've learned to call supernatural because we lack better vocabulary, because our language evolved for transactions and taxonomies rather than for describing the numinous, the beings that exist in the margins of our neat categories, that refuse to be classified because classification is itself a kind of violence, a diminishment of complexity into manageable fiction. I turned to the final entry, dated 3 days before his death, and my grandfather's writing had deteriorated to barely legible scrawl. It came to me tonight and, for the first time in 50 years, it spoke not with borrowed voices, but with its own, a sound like stones remembering when they were molten, like the earth's first word. And it told me that my grandchild would need to understand faster than I did, because the world is forgetting how to see, because the forests are shrinking and the old places are being paved, and soon there will be nowhere left for the things that cannot survive documentation, that exist only in the spaces we've agreed not to illuminate. And I am afraid not of dying, but of failing to prepare you, of leaving you alone with knowledge that should take decades to integrate, but must be compressed into a single encounter, a single night when grief opens you enough to perceive what fear would normally blind you to. When the creature can slip past your defenses disguised as loss and plant in you the seed of understanding that will either grow into wisdom or drive you into the madness that claimed your great uncle Marcus, who tried to share what he'd learned and was institutionalized for his honesty. My throat constricted as I read those words, realizing my grandfather had carried not just knowledge but fear, had worried that this inheritance was as much curse as gift, that some minds broke under the weight of perceiving what consensus reality insisted didn't exist, and he'd spent his final days gambling that I had the resilience to contain paradox, to hold multiple truths simultaneously without fracturing into the kind of incoherence that our culture mistakes for insanity, when it's actually just unmetabolized encounter with the real. The static from the phone suddenly resolved into perfect clarity, and I heard my own voice speaking, words I'd never said, describing what I was seeing in this very moment with such accuracy that I understood the creature wasn't predicting, but rather showing me that time and its presence worked differently, that past and future were human constructs it didn't honor, that it existed in some eternal present where all moments touched, and my choice to continue listening or to flee in terror hadn't yet been determined, was still quantum, still superposed. And the voice that was mine, but not mine, said, "You're realizing now that everything you thought was metaphor in grandfather's stories was documentary, that the creature isn't symbol, but citizen of a world that coexists with ours in the same space, separated not by distance but by perception, by the filters we've installed to navigate consensus reality without going mad from stimulus. And your understanding that this encounter has changed those filters permanently, has adjusted your capacity to perceive in ways that can never be reversed, and you must decide in the next 30 seconds whether to walk out that door and face what's waiting in the darkness, or to pack your things and drive away and spend the rest of your life wondering if you imagined everything, if grief and isolation produced a psychotic break you'll have to hide from therapists and loved ones who would see your truth as symptom, as something requiring medication and management rather than integration and honor." The voice stopped, and I sat in silence so complete it felt solid, and I realized the creature had given me choice, had structured this entire night as test and invitation simultaneously, and my grandfather's ghost or memory or whatever remained of him in this place was holding its breath, waiting to see if his gamble on my character had been justified or if I would be the generation that broke the chain, that chose comfortable blindness over difficult seeing. I stood and felt my legs remember how to move, though my mind hadn't yet agreed to the decision, and I understood the body carries its own wisdom that predates thought, that my muscles and bones had already chosen while my consciousness still debated. And I walked to the cabin door with the sensation of watching myself from a great distance, as if I'd split into observer and participant, as if the creature's presence had fractured me into multiple perspectives simultaneously, and my hand reached for the doorknob that felt impossibly cold against my palm, and I thought about my grandfather, making this same walk decades ago, how every generation faced this threshold alone despite being part of an unbroken chain, how the knowledge couldn't be inherited through words, but only through direct encounter, through placing your body in proximity to something that shouldn't exist but does. And I pulled open the door to darkness so absolute it seemed to have texture, to have weight, to pour into the cabin like liquid night, and the forest beyond held its breath as I stepped across the threshold into air that tasted ancient, that filled my lungs with the cold clarity of absolute commitment to seeing what can't be unseen, to knowing what can't be unknown. The clearing before the cabin was empty, but I felt the creature's presence the way you feel a storm building before the first drop falls, as pressure change, as electricity in the blood, and I understood it was giving me time to adjust, to let my eyes accommodate not just to darkness, but to perceiving layers of reality that daylight usually obscures, and gradually I began to see the space between trees differently, to notice how shadows moved against the wind rather than with it, how certain patches of darkness were darker than physics should allow, and I realized I was seeing the creature's true form for the first time. Not the half-glimpsed silhouette from the forest, but its actual presence, which existed partially in this dimension and partially in some adjacent space. My grandfather's journal had called the threshold country, and it was massive beyond what the moonlit glimpse had suggested, tall as the pines and somehow folded into geometries my brain kept trying to flatten into comprehensible shapes, and I felt tears on my face though I wasn't sad, felt my body responding to beauty and terror simultaneously, because the creature was both. was the most magnificent and most alien thing I'd ever witnessed. And I understood why my grandfather had kept returning here. Why he'd chosen to die in proximity to this being that made everything else feel diminished by comparison, hollow, like we spend our lives in waiting rooms convinced they're palaces until we see what actual grandeur looks like. The creature moved and I heard its voice for the first time, without technological mediation, without the borrowed sounds of human speech, and it was like hearing geology speak, like mountains explaining themselves to valleys, a resonance that bypassed my ears and vibrated directly through bone and organs and the electrical firing of synapses. And I understood language not as sound, but as pure meaning transferred through frequencies. My body recognized, even though my mind had no reference for them. And the creature was saying something about continuity, about how it had watched my family since my ancestors first cleared land beside this lake, how it had observed our births and deaths with the patience of something for whom human lifespans were like seasons, brief and necessary and part of larger cycles we couldn't perceive from inside our limited perspective. And it was explaining that the mimicry wasn't cruelty but gift, that it preserved the voices of our dead not as haunting but as archive, as living library of everyone who'd come before. And it had called to me with my grandfather's voice because that was the only sound that could penetrate my grief enough to bring me into the forest, into range of teaching that couldn't happen within walls, within the false safety of human construction. I opened my mouth and the prayer I'd spoken before came out differently this time. Not half-remembered fragments, but complete phrases in a language I didn't know I knew. Words my grandmother had sung as lullabies that I'd thought were nonsense, but were actually invocations, protections, acknowledgments of the old agreements between my family and this being. And I felt the creature's attention focus on me with an intensity that should have been crushing, but instead felt like recognition, like being truly seen for the first time in my life. And it stepped fully into the clearing and lowered its massive head until its eyes were level with mine. And I looked into them and saw, reflected there not just my face but my grandfather's face, and faces stretching back through generations. And I understood I was looking at our family's true history, our real inheritance. And the creature opened its mouth and sang with every voice it had ever preserved, including my grandfather's, creating a chord of ancestral memory that surrounded me like embrace, like welcome. Like the creature was saying, you are not the end of forgetting, but the beginning of remembering. And I stood in that clearing and accepted the weight of knowledge that would separate me forever from the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about what's real. And I knew my grandfather was finally at peace, because the chain remained unbroken, because I had walked through the door he'd left open. The creature straightened slowly, and I watched its form shift in the moonlight, revealing details I hadn't been able to process before. The way its fur moved like water over muscle and tendon, how its limbs bent at angles that suggested a skeleton designed for purposes beyond simple locomotion. And I saw carved into the ancient wood of the surrounding pines symbols that matched those in my grandfather's journal, territorial markers or sacred boundaries worn smooth by decades of weather. And I understood this clearing was intentional space, maintained across generations as meeting ground between worlds. And the creature began to circle me not with predatory intent, but with ceremonial purpose, moving in patterns that felt choreographed by tradition. And its footfalls made no sound despite its massive weight, as if it existed in selective relationship with physical laws, choosing which to honor and which to transcend. And I remained still, at the center of its orbit, feeling like I'd become access point for something that had been turning long before I was born, and would continue turning long after I was gone. And the creature completed its circle and stood before me again, and I saw in the architecture of its face something that wasn't quite wolf and wasn't quite human, but synthesized both into a third category that predated our false division between animal and person, that remembered when the boundaries were more permeable, when transformation was commonplace and the forest held more citizens than we currently acknowledge. It lowered itself into a posture that looked like sitting but felt like ceremony, haunches folded beneath its body and head tilted at an angle of listening. And I understood it was offering me time to ask questions, though not with words, that the communication we'd established ran deeper than language, operated through intention and attention. And I thought about everything I wanted to know, the full taxonomy of mystery and meaning, but found myself simply asking why, not why my family specifically, but why this arrangement at all. Why reveal yourself to generation after generation when remaining hidden would be easier? and the creature's eyes held mine with bottomless patience while meaning transferred between us. Not as answer but as understanding, and I felt myself comprehending that the creature needed witnesses the way we need breath, that being perceived by human consciousness somehow sustained it, kept it tethered to existence in a world that had mostly stopped believing in the spaces between things, and we had been chosen not as victims but as keepers, as family who would remember when others forgot, who would maintain the threshold through simple acknowledgement. And my grandfather's life suddenly made terrible and beautiful sense. How he'd carried this weight alone because the knowing couldn't be shared, only experienced. How he'd returned here season after season to fulfill obligations that had no name in modern language but were binding nonetheless. And I felt gratitude crash through me like grief's opposite, overwhelming and clarifying, because I understood I hadn't lost my grandfather to death, but had inherited his role in a relationship, older than the trees, older than the lake, older than the stories we told about how the world was supposed to work. The creature rose and I saw it, preparing to leave. Felt the encounter reaching its natural conclusion the way you feel a conversation ending, even before the final words, and I wanted to ask it to stay, to teach me everything, to compress generations of accumulated wisdom into this single night. But I understood that wasn't how the inheritance worked, that I would return here as my grandfather had, season after season, building relationship through patient presence rather than desperate acquisition. And the creature moved toward the tree line and paused, looking back at me with expression I couldn't name, but felt in my chest as ache and wonder combined, and it opened its mouth and released sound that was neither human nor animal but something that contained multitudes, harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself, from bedrock and root systems and the lake's dark water. And I recognized it as goodbye and blessing simultaneously, as acknowledgement that I had passed whatever test the encounter represented. And it sang one final phrase in my grandfather's voice, the exact tone and cadence I remembered from childhood, saying, "You did well and I'm proud and I love you." And I broke then, fell to my knees in the clearing with tears streaming hot against the cold night, and the creature watched until my sobbing quieted, until I looked up and met its eyes one final time, and then it turned and walked into darkness that accepted it completely, that folded around its massive form like the forest was embracing something beloved. And I was alone in the clearing but not lonely, filled instead with the profound peace of understanding exactly where I stood in the architecture of inheritance. I walked back to the cabin carrying my grandfather's journal against my chest like sacred text, feeling the weight of pages filled with observations and sketches that I could now read, not as paranoid ramblings, but as meticulous documentation of relationship, of love expressed through attention and respect. And the stars overhead seemed impossibly bright, like the encounter had adjusted something in my vision, let me perceive wavelengths of light I'd been blind to before. And I understood my grandfather had died seeing the same sky, had passed from life into death with eyes fully open to beauty that exists in the margins of ordinary perception. And I felt honored rather than burdened by the inheritance, chosen rather than cursed, and I knew I would return to my regular life changed in ways I couldn't yet articulate, but would spend years integrating. And someday I might have children, and I would watch them carefully for the signs my grandfather must have watched in me, the sensitivity to threshold spaces, the comfort with mystery, the willingness to walk into fog-drenched forests at dawn. And if I saw those signs I would know what I was preparing them for, what inheritance waited patient and ancient in the woods beside the lake, and I would teach them the prayers, disguised as lullabies, the old language sleeping in their blood. And I would tell them their great-grandfather's story not as warning, but as legacy, as proof that some mysteries don't diminish us but expand us, make us larger and more complete. And I opened the cabin door and stepped inside carrying the night's revelation like light source, like I'd swallowed the moon and it was illuminating me from within. I sat at my grandfather's desk, with my phone in trembling hands, the device suddenly feeling like artifact from another world. And I opened the recording app with dread pooling cold in my stomach because part of me didn't want evidence, wanted to keep the encounter pristine and personal rather than translated into data. But I pressed play and heard only static at first, the white noise of technical failure or supernatural interference, and I fast-forwarded through minutes of nothing until I heard it, my grandfather's voice emerging from the static like signal, breaking through atmospheric disturbance, saying, "Now you understand why we never forget." And the clarity was impossible, every syllable crisp and intentional, and I played it again and again, listening for artifice or explanation, but found only his voice exactly as I remembered it, warm and certain and proud. And I understood the recording wasn't meant as proof for others, but as confirmation for me, as anchor I could return to when doubt crept in during ordinary daylight hours, when the encounter started feeling like dream or delusion, and I saved the file, with hands that knew they were holding the only inheritance that mattered, not property or money, but knowledge, evidence of continuity, proof that love doesn't end with death but transforms into different expressions. And I wept again, but quietly now, tears of completion rather than loss. And I knew my grandfather had orchestrated this across the barrier of death, had somehow arranged for the creature to speak those specific words, had left this final message knowing I would need it. I spent the rest of the night reading his journal, from beginning to end, decades of entries documenting encounters that followed patterns I now recognized, the seasonal rhythms of appearance and withdrawal, the creature's preferences for fog and twilight, its sensitivity to disrespect and violence, how it had shown itself to my grandfather's father and his father before that, an unbroken chain of witnesses stretching back to when my family first settled beside the lake. And I found drawings that captured the creature with artist's precision, the anatomical impossibilities rendered careful and accurate, and margin notes in multiple languages including the old words my grandfather had taught me as child, prayers I'd thought were nonsense syllables, but now recognized as formulas of protection and invitation, as vocabulary for negotiating with intelligence that predated human categories. And I discovered pressed flowers marking certain pages, botanical specimens from the clearing where I'd stood hours before, and I understood my grandfather had been keeping record not just for himself, but for me, had known I would eventually sit at this desk and need guidance, and his handwriting seemed to speak directly across time, seemed to say, "You're not alone in this, you're part of something larger." And I felt held by the weight of generations, by the accumulated wisdom of men who'd walked into the forest carrying respect, and returned carrying wonder. As dawn light began filtering through the cabin windows, I went outside carrying the urn of my grandfather's ashes, and I walked to the clearing guided by instinct and memory, and the forest felt different now, not threatening but welcoming, like I'd been granted citizenship in a country I'd been visiting as tourist before. And I reached the clearing where ceremonial trees marked the boundary, and I opened the urn and spoke the prayer my grandfather had taught me, the old words, flowing easier now that I understood their purpose. And I scattered his ashes in the space where I'd knelt hours before, returning him to the threshold he'd maintained for decades. And I felt rightness in the gesture that transcended grief, felt like I was completing circuit that had been open too long. And the morning wind picked up and carried the ashes in spiraling patterns that looked almost choreographed, almost like the creature's circling walk. And I understood my grandfather would remain here not as ghost but as presence, as memory held by earth and tree and the intelligence that walked between them. And I stood in the clearing until the urn was empty, and the sun had fully risen. And I felt him in the light and the bird calls returning, and the fog beginning to lift. And I knew I would scatter my own ashes here eventually, would join the accumulated generations feeding the threshold, and the thought brought comfort rather than fear. I left the cabin that afternoon carrying less than I'd brought, leaving behind the heaviness of unfinished grief and taking instead the lightness of purpose. And I drove away watching the forest in my rearview mirror. And I swear I saw movement between the pines, massive and dark and watching, and I raised my hand in farewell and the movement stilled in what felt like acknowledgement, and I understood I wasn't leaving but beginning, starting the patient work of living with mystery, of carrying knowledge that couldn't be shared but only witnessed. And I would return next season and the season after that, would build relationship through presence the way my grandfather had, and someday when my own death approached I would make final arrangements to return here, to this threshold where the world is larger than we admit and love survives in forms we're only beginning to understand. And I drove toward the highway carrying my grandfather's journal, and the recording of his impossible voice and the bone-deep certainty that some inheritances don't diminish us but complete us, make us finally and fully who we were always meant to become. What inheritance are you carrying that you don't yet understand? Subscribe to hear more stories from the spaces between worlds.